We crossed mountains that pierced the sky, and rivers that ran so cold they shattered the bones of men who fell through the ice. We rode under the banner of the Khan, the man chosen by the eternal blue sky, the man whose name alone made cities open their gates in surrender before we even arrived. We believed we were destiny made flesh. We believed that heaven itself guided our arrows, that the wind carried our war cries, that we were the scourge meant to remake the world. We rode with pride, with purpose, with absolute certainty that what we did was right because the Khan had commanded it, and the Khan did not command without the blessing of Tengri, the god above all gods. But no river, no matter how cold, has washed the blood from our hands. No prayer, no matter how many times whispered into the darkness, has silenced the screams we still hear at night. And no distance, not even the vastness of the steppes that we crossed in service of empire, has been enough to outrun what we became. I'm old now. My hands shake when I hold a cup. My eyes are clouded. My back is bent from years of riding, of fighting, of carrying weight that was never meant to be carried by one man alone. But I remember everything. And that is my punishment. Because forgetting would be mercy, and we do not deserve mercy. This is not a story of glory. This is not a tale of conquest or honor or the greatness of the Mongol Empire. Those stories have been told. Those stories are carved into stone and sung by poets and whispered with reverence around fires. This is the story that comes after. The story that happens when the battle is won, when the city has fallen, when the men are dead and the gates are broken and the flames have died down to embers. This is the story of what we did when no one was watching except the gods, and the gods, we learned, are silent when it matters most. We served Genghis Khan. That phrase alone carries weight. It carries history. It carries the shadow of a man who united tribes that had spent centuries killing each other, who built an empire that stretched farther than any before it, who created laws and roads and a postal system that connected the world in ways it had never been connected. He was brilliant. He was ruthless. He was the storm that reshaped the earth. But we were not him. We were the soldiers, the warriors, the ones who carried out his vision with swords and arrows and fire. And when the vision required more than battle, when it required something darker, something that had no place in songs or histories, we did that too. Because we had been taught that obedience was the highest virtue. That hesitation was cowardice, that mercy toward enemies was weakness that endangered the horde. The city we remember most clearly had no name that I can speak aloud without feeling my throat close. It does not matter what it was called. It was like so many others, walls, markets, temples, people who had lived there for generations, who had raised children and buried parents and believed that their walls would protect them. They were wrong. We surrounded the city for 3 weeks. We cut off supply lines. We sent emissaries with demands. Surrender, pay tribute, open your gates, and you will be spared. The city refused. Their prince was young, arrogant, convinced that his walls were strong enough, that his soldiers were brave enough, that help would come from neighboring kingdoms. Help did not come. It never did. By the time cities realized that no one was coming to save them, it was too late. When we breached the walls, the resistance lasted less than a day. Their soldiers fought bravely. Some of them died well, weapons in hand, defiant to the end. Others threw down their swords and begged. It did not matter. The Khan's orders were clear. Resistance meant annihilation. Every man of fighting age was to be executed. Every building of strategic importance was to be burned. The city was to serve as a message to every other city that thought to refuse us. We carried out those orders. We lined the men up in the central square, thousands of them. We killed them efficiently, methodically, the way you would slaughter livestock. We did not take pleasure in it. That is important to understand. We were not sadists. We were soldiers following commands. We told ourselves it was necessary, that this was war, that this was what conquest looked like, that every empire in history had done the same. But the men were not the only ones left behind. The women and children were gathered in the square after the executions, mothers holding infants, daughters clutching their mothers, elderly women who could barely stand. Young women, some no older than 15, their eyes wide with terror, their hands shaking as they tried to cover themselves, to make themselves small, invisible, unworthy of attention. The commanders divided them. Some would be sent back to the Khan's court as tribute, some would be distributed among the officers, some would be given to the soldiers as rewards for their service, and some, the ones who were too old or too sick or too defiant, were deemed useless. Their fate was quicker, crueler. We do not speak of what happened to them. I remember one woman in particular. I do not know why she stayed in my memory when so many others have blurred into a mass of faces and screams and tears. Perhaps because she did not cry. Perhaps because she looked directly at us, not with hatred, not with fear, but with something else. Disappointment, as if she had expected more from us, as if she had believed until that moment that human beings were capable of something better than what we were doing. Her name was Kaliun. I learned that later, from one of the translators. She had been the wife of a commander, one of the men we had executed in the square. She had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The son had been killed in the battle. The daughters were somewhere in the crowd, clinging to each other, trying not to be noticed. Kaliun was maybe 30 years old. Her hair was dark, braided in the way women of that city wore it. Her dress was torn. Her hands were bound. She was brought before one of our captains, a man named Batu. Batu was not cruel by nature. He was practical. He followed orders. He believed in discipline and structure and the necessity of fear to maintain control. He looked at Kaliun and said something in Mongolian. The translator repeated it in her language. "You will serve. If you obey, you will live. If you resist, you will not." Kaliun looked at him, and then she spat at his feet. The soldiers around us tensed. Spitting at a Mongol officer was not just defiance, it was suicide. Batu could have killed her right there. He had the authority. He had the justification. No one would have questioned it. But he did not. He smiled. Not with warmth, with something colder, with the satisfaction of someone who has been given permission to break something. "Take her to the tent," he said. "I will deal with her after the others are distributed." I was one of the soldiers assigned to take her. There were 4 of us. We grabbed her arms, dragged her through the square, past the bodies of the men, past the women who watched with hollow eyes, past the children who had stopped crying because they had learned that crying only made things worse. We took her to a yurt at the edge of the camp, the one reserved for prisoners who required special attention. We tied her to a post. We left her there, and we walked away. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. The camp was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes you hear things that are not there, or perhaps things that are there but that you wish you could not hear. Whispers, prayers, the rustle of fabric, the creak of ropes, the sound of someone crying so quietly that you could only hear it if you were listening for it. Batu went to the yurt after midnight. He stayed for an hour. When he came out, his face was unreadable. He said nothing. He walked to his own tent and did not emerge until morning. At dawn, we were ordered to bring Kaliun back to the square. We untied her. She could barely stand. Her dress was torn worse than before. Her wrists were bleeding from the ropes, but her eyes were still defiant, still unbroken. She walked with her head up, her shoulders back, as if she were walking to a coronation rather than whatever awaited her in the square. Batu was waiting. The other women and children had been assembled to watch. This was intentional. This was part of the strategy. Fear, we had been taught, was more effective than violence. One public example could prevent 100 future rebellions. Batu addressed the crowd through the translator. He explained that Kaliun had been given a choice, that she had chosen defiance. That defiance against the Mongol Empire could not be tolerated, that this was justice. Then he gave the order. I was not the one who carried it out. But I was there. I watched. We all watched, because that was part of it too. We were all complicit, all witnesses, all participants in the machine that ground people into dust and called it civilization. Kaliun did not scream. She did not beg. She looked at Batu, and then she looked at the sky, and then she closed her eyes. And when it was over, her daughters, the two little girls who had been clinging to each other in the crowd, finally broke their silence. Their screams were so loud, so raw, that some of the soldiers turned away, but most of us did not. We stood there. We watched, because we had been trained not to look away, because looking away would mean acknowledging that what we were doing was wrong, and we could not afford to acknowledge that. The girls were taken away. I do not know what happened to them. I tell myself they were sent to a household somewhere, that they grew up, that they survived, but I do not know, and the not knowing is worse than knowing. We stayed in that city for 2 more weeks. We burned the temples. We melted down the gold. We took everything of value and loaded it onto carts. We left the city a skeleton, a warning to anyone who passed through, and then we moved on to the next city, the next battle, the next conquest. But something had changed, not in the orders we received, not in the structure of the army, but in us, in the men who had watched Kaliun die, in the men who had dragged women into tents, in the men who had stood guard while other men did things that should never be done. There was a soldier named Temur. He was young, maybe 20, with a wife and child back in the homeland. He had joined the army because it was the only way to provide for his family, because serving the Khan meant status and protection and a share of the spoils. He had been a good soldier, obedient, brave. He had killed men in battle without hesitation. But after that night, after Kaliun, after the tents, he stopped speaking. He would sit by the fire and stare into the flames, his eyes empty, his hands shaking. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. When we asked him what was wrong, he would not answer. One night he walked away from the camp. We found him the next morning, hanging from a tree, his belt around his neck, his face grey. There was no note, no explanation. But we all knew why. The commanders said he had been weak, that the campaign had broken him, that not all men were suited for the life of a warrior. They said this as a warning, as a reminder that weakness was not tolerated, that soldiers who could not carry the weight of what we did were liabilities. But Temur was not weak. He was the only one brave enough to stop. We kept riding, kept fighting, kept carrying out orders. But more men began to break. Some drank fermented mare's milk until they could not stand, until they passed out and did not have to think or remember. Some became more violent, as if by escalating the cruelty they could convince themselves that they felt nothing, that they were simply tools of war, unfeeling and efficient. Some became quiet, like Temur, and we learned to watch them, to take their weapons at night to make sure they did not walk away from the camp. And some of us, the ones who survived, who lived long enough to grow old and return to the homeland, carried it differently. We carried it in silence. We told our children about the battles, about the victories, about the greatness of the Khan. But we never told them about the nights, about the tents, about Kaliun, about the women whose names we never learned, about the screams that echoed long after the camps were packed up and we rode away. I married when I returned. I had children. I tried to build a life that looked normal, that looked like peace. But peace is not something you can build on a foundation of blood. My wife asked me once why I woke up screaming, why I could not bear to hear children cry, why I flinched when she touched me unexpectedly. I told her it was the war, that all soldiers carried scars. She believed me because she wanted to believe me, because the alternative was too terrible to accept. But it was not the war, Or rather, it was not the part of the war that people talk about. It was not the battles or the sieges or the glory. It was the part that came after, the part that happened in the dark, the part that we did not do for victory or strategy or survival, the part that we did because we were told to and we obeyed, and obedience absolved us of responsibility. Or so we believed. The Mongol Empire is remembered as one of the greatest in history. We are taught that Genghis Khan united the tribes, that he created laws, that he established trade routes and religious tolerance, and a meritocracy that allowed anyone, regardless of birth, to rise through the ranks. All of that is true. But it is not the whole truth. Because empires are not built only on law and trade and vision. They are built on the bodies of the conquered, on the silence of the survivors, on the complicity of soldiers who follow orders and tell themselves that they have no choice. We had choices. We always had choices. We could have refused. We could have spoken. We could have protected the women instead of taking them. We could have chosen mercy over obedience, but we did not, because mercy was dangerous, because compassion made you vulnerable, because we had been taught that the only loyalty that mattered was loyalty to the Khan, to the horde, to the empire, and anything that threatened that loyalty had to be crushed. I think about Kaliun often. I think about her daughters. I think about Timur. I think about the translator who had to repeat our commands in languages he had learned as a child, who had to watch his own people destroyed and say nothing because he too was a prisoner, just one with a longer leash. I think about all the women whose names I never learned, whose faces I can no longer remember, who disappeared into the silence of history because no one recorded their stories, because they were considered spoils, property, irrelevant except as symbols of our dominance. I'm dying now. The shamans say I have maybe a season left, maybe less. My children will bury me in the steppes, and they will say prayers, and they will honor me as a warrior who served the Khan. They will not know the truth. I have made sure of that, because the truth would destroy them. Because the truth would make them question everything they have been taught about honor and duty and the glory of their heritage. But I know, and knowing is the punishment that I will carry into whatever comes next. If there is a judgment after death, if Tengri weighs the souls of men, then I will be found wanting. If there is a hell, I will go there willingly because I deserve it. And if there is nothing, if death is only silence and darkness, then perhaps that is its own kind of hell, an eternity of quiet in which the screams I ignored will echo forever. We served Genghis Khan. We built an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. We changed the world, but the cost of that change, the human cost, the price paid by people like Kaliun and her daughters, by the women in the tents, by the men like Timur who could not live with what they had done, that cost is not written in the histories. That cost is carried in silence by men like me, men who obeyed, men who told themselves that they had no choice, men who lived long enough to realize that we always had a choice and we chose wrong. Empires fall. Bones turn to dust. The yurts are taken down. The horses die. The banners rot. But the silence we chose, the silence we demanded of the women we took, the silence we wrapped around our guilt like armor, that silence still lives. It lives in the wind that crosses the steppes. It lives in the ruins of cities that never rebuilt. It lives in the absence of names, of stories, of voices that should have been heard and were not. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I do not ask for understanding. What we did cannot be understood, only witnessed. I tell this story not to absolve myself, but because someone must. Because if no one speaks, if the silence continues, then we will have succeeded not only in destroying those women, but in erasing them from memory entirely. And that I have learned too late is the greatest cruelty of all. If you are still here, then you have heard what history tried to bury, what empires built their glory upon, what soldiers carried in silence to their graves. Stay, subscribe, before this too is forgotten, before the wind carries it away, before the silence swallows it whole. Because some truths, no matter how terrible, must be spoken, and some debts, no matter how old, can never be repaid.